I'd like to welcome everybody to the annual Neil Aggett Labour Studies Lecture. This is an event organized by the Neil Aggett Labour Studies Unit at Rhodes University in Makhanda, the Eastern Cape, South Africa. We partner it with our annual Vuyisile Mini Workers School, but it's also a public event. So in the house here, we have many people from the trade unions, from all the big federations, some comrades from the unemployed people's movement, some people from the town, and of course we have Eddie Webster right here in front. And online I can see we have many people. So that's fantastic. See some familiar faces. Well, before I get to the speaker, I would like to just start with a few words about Neil Aggett and why we think it's important to commemorate Comrade Aggett and why we try to keep the memory of people like Neil Aggett alive. We will show a little bit of footage now, but I will just provide a bit of context for that. Neil Aggett, Neil Hudson Aggett, was born in Kenya. His family moved to South Africa. As a young man, he went to school in Grahamstown, as it was then, in Makhanda, as it is now, at Kingswood. After school, he studied to be a medical doctor. He became involved in the liberation struggle, and in particular in the trade union movement, in particular the Food and Canning Workers Union. This was a union, two sections, the Food and Canning Workers Union, the African Food and Canning Workers Union. It dated back to the 1940s. Its founders included people like Mare Alexander. It was a union that had been survived the dark years of the 1960s and became important again with the upsurge of trade unionism in the 70s and 80s. Now, today we often take for granted some of the freedoms that we have today, but that tree of freedom was watered with the blood of martyrs. The apartheid state did not tolerate disagreement. Free speech was not a thing that existed in those days, and the laws allowed incredible scope for the government to crack down on disagreement and dissent. Eddie Webster here was arrested in 1976, 75 for promoting black consciousness. So there we go. I believe the judge said you were an arrogant young man. To which your father said, "What's wrong with that?" Neil Aggett, I don't believe, has ever been called an arrogant young man. As a young doctor in his 20s, he used to work in the black hospitals, seeing the appalling conditions under which the black working class lived and died. And in the day, he would give up his time for free to work for the trade union movement. In one of the periodic crackdowns by the apartheid state, he was among those who was arrested, 1982. In those days, the state had the power of detention without trial. What this meant is you could be jailed. No charges were necessarily preferred against you. You had no guaranteed access to a lawyer, to visitors, to family. He was taken to John Foster Square in Joburg in Newtown, near what is now Mary Fitzgerald Square, across from what is now the Workers' Museum. He was tortured, he was beaten, and one day he was found dead in his cell. There was an inquest at the time, which effectively exonerated the police, but the matter was reopened recently, and the new judgment found differently. Neil was not in a state that would allow him to hang himself from the roof of his cell. People had seen him dragged along the passage, unable to walk, barely coherent. One of the significant things about Neil Aggett's death was that it was an opportunity, a moment where trade unions across political divides, including unions of the more traditional sorts, like the Cape Town Municipal Workers Association, associated with the old TUCSA tradition, unions in Fosatu, community unions like SAWU, joined in a national general protest strike. We're going to show a bit of footage from the funeral. but I'm sure Eddie may also have some things to say about it. I don't want to say anything about Neil now or after the video. But I think it's important to remember things aren't perfect now, but there was a massive victory in 1994. It's not meaningless. We can disagree and we get ignored, but in those days you disagreed and you could die for that. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of wrong things. It doesn't mean there's not criminal activity by parts of the state. Doesn't mean there are not many, many threats to our limited democracy, but we're better than we were. The link between Vuyisile Mini and Neil Aggett. These were both martyrs, trade unionists, progressive people, who fought and died for the working class and for new South Africa. Vuyisile Mini, born in Zomo, the mountains, worked what was then Port Elizabeth, was involved in the African National Congress, the underground South African Communist Party, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, involved in organizing, known as organizer of the unorganized. As the repression of the Verwoerd government came down in the early 60s, he was involved actively in Umkhonto weSizwe. In 1964, he was hanged in Pretoria. His body only returned to his homestead at the end of 2020. We recognize here the family of Vuyisile Mini, two of his sons, one of his great granddaughters. Thank you for being here. I want to now shift to introduce Eddie Webster, our guest for the day. There's many things I could say about Eddie Webster. It would take a long time to go through all the things that Comrade Eddie has done. Eddie Webster comes from a generation, some think of them as the 1968 generation in a way. Young people in those days who wanted to change the world. Originally, Comrade Eddie was looking for his PhD thesis. He was interested in the question of the Indian African race riots in Durban. But he shifted and to look at trade unions, and the rest is really history. Like many people of that time, he was deeply inspired by the big class struggles of the 60s and 70s, which in South Africa took the form of the new wave of trade unionism that began in Durban 1973, 50 years ago in February next year. Eddie has played an absolutely critical role in reshaping the field of industrial and economic sociology, a field which before then had often been based on trying to work out ways to better manage workers, to improve productivity, to humanize capitalist industry. People like Eddie Webster using a new set of tools influenced by Marxism, influenced by a range of new ideas, innovative approaches, brought things down to look at the composition of the working class, the structure of the labor process and of accumulation, the spaces and leverage for power by ordinary people to reshape society, and the possibilities that were opened up by mass democratic labor movements. Not a labor movement that operates as a service provider where you phone and you get things fixed up like an insurance company, but a union movement that didn't serve workers, but that was the workers. His famous book of 1985, Cast in a Racial Mould, looked at race in the foundries, in heavy industry, how the racial division of labor was structured by particular organizations of capitalism and how this changed with moves to mechanization. And the scope this changed, this opened both for reorganizing the working class, but also for new divisions in the working class. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, Eddie was keenly grappling with the question of the winners and losers as South Africa's economy restructured, because we must remember we did not just have a transition to a bourgeois parliamentary democracy, but there was also an ongoing shift towards an open neoliberal economy. This did not start in 96 with Gear. In 1980s, ISCOR, the massive state steel and iron industry, was privatized. Sasol was mostly privatized. Many of the laws that actually set up Eskom as put it on the path to becoming a profit-seeking, tax-paying, corporatized state utility took place there. So what would happen? How would the working class change? How could the working class at the same time take the opportunity to reshape society. A very common theory at the time was that transitions to parliamentary democracy essentially leave out the working class. And what Eddie, people like Glenn Adler argued was that workers left a profound imprint. They were not present in negotiations at CUDESA, for example, but they reshaped things. The new Labor Relations Act, the NEDLAC Act, the Reform-Based Conditions of Employment Act, a whole wide range of policy changes. But as things moved on, the working class also started to change. And I think this is very much an issue that Eddie has been looking at. The last thing I just want to mention here is Eddie Webster's connection to Rhodes University. Eddie Webster is also a son of the Eastern Cape. He studied his undergraduate studies at Rhodes University, where he was captain of the rugby team, SRC President. Well, what else can I say? A man with a lively social life, and influenced, I think, by a historian who was more interested in Queen Anne and the old style history from above. People like Eddie were influenced by the new idea of how is history shaped by the masses, by both its authors and its victims. Eddie Webster went on to other studies, eventually did his PhD at Wits University, if I'm not mistaken. A great university, by the way. I'm just saying that it's also come from there, but not, of course, the only great university. Anyway, there he founded the Sociology of Work project, which continues in a new form, reshaped the discipline, ran workers' education courses, and retired at the age of 65, which is a while back. Since then, he's had a second career, inter alia, being head of the Chris Hani Institute, writing 5 or 6 books, as one does. Setting up a publishing series of books called Hidden Voices, which we published worker biographies, studies from below, and helping establish and run the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits. So without further ado, I will mention he's not just got 1 doctorate, but several. Both Wits and Rhodes University have given him honorary doctorates. So I suppose we could call him Professor, Doctor, Eddie Webster. If in Germany, Herr Professor, Dr. Eddie Webster. But he remains associated with Rhodes, where he is a professor linked to the Institute of Social and Economic Research, the organization from which the Neil Aggett Labour Studies Unit originally emerged as well, although we are now in a separate structure. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Eddie, but let's give him a round.
Thanks very much, Vuyisile. We are gathered here today to remember the life and death of Neil Aggett, medical doctor and trade unionist, murdered by the apartheid security police in the early hours of the morning of the 5th of February, 1982. I'm deeply honored to have been invited to give the annual Neil Aggett Labour Studies lecture. This year is an historic year in the 40-year controversy over Neil Aggett's death in detention. On the 4th of March this year, the judge overturned the findings of the 1982 inquest in his ruling in the Johannesburg High Court. After a thorough inquiry based on factual evidence and depositions of former members of the security branch and fellow detainees. The court ruled that Dr. Neil Aggett did not die by suicide, but was killed by members of the apartheid security police. This sets in motion avenues for the National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute those security branch police officers responsible for the death and the cover-up, which followed the judges, which followed. The judge referred to the earlier findings in the original inquest as a serious error in judgment, and his conclusions as mind-blowingly weak. Reading the evidence by the detainees in the second inquest, I was reminded of the shocking brutality of the apartheid security police. It was a frightening time for opponents of apartheid. The Terrorism Act allowed the police to detain suspects indefinitely, isolated on their own in a prison cell. And this gave the police unbridled access to torture the detainees. These detainees, men and women, white and black, were a remarkable generation of committed activists. Beverly Naidu, in her celebrated book on Neil, titled the book Death of an Idealist. Death of an Idealist. Today, nearly 2 generations later, we face similar challenges. Growing inequality, massive unemployment, casualization of work, and the threat of ecological devastation. The idealism and sacrifice displayed by Neil Aggett and so many, many others appears to have been replaced today by cynicism and greed. But as Beverly Naidu writes, the story of Neil Aggett is a reminder that every generation needs its idealists. I agree. What we need today is a new generation of idealists. Idealists like Neil, who drew on his privileged education here at Kingswood College, at the University of Cape Town, to help empower working people. Neil believed that the working poor need a voice. But importantly, he believed that this voice had to be built from below, through shop stewards who are accountable to their members. My hunch is that Neil would have been uncomfortable with the idea that union leaders become billionaires. And he would have been worried by the gap that has emerged between the general secretaries of some unions with over 1 million rand a year salary, driving flashy motor cars on one hand, and the growing number of workers in precarious, low-paid, and dangerous jobs. In that sense, we are in a similar period to the late 70s, when large numbers of workers were unorganized, what I call the representational gap, and unionists like Neil were trying to overcome that representational gap by organizing precarious workers in the Food and Canning Workers Union, which at the time was struggling for recognition. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, well, why remember Neil Aggett at a time when the world of work seems to have changed so much? I want to take as my point of departure the widely held narrative that we are in a new world of work, the fourth industrial revolution. 5 years ago, I was given a copy of the life of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is the founder of Apple. It's an intriguing story, and it's a big book, 600 pages. And it's all about this man, this entrepreneur, who designed the Big Mac. An entrepreneur marketing this brilliant way of using the new technology of the digital age. But, and here's the puzzle, not a word about the men and women who produced the computer, the laptop. Not a word. But of course, on the other side of the United States, in China, right now, there are men and women in a company called Foxconn, whose conditions are so bad that workers were committing suicide by jumping from the top of the building. And believe it or not, the company built a net around. So if you jump into a net, don't get killed. Now, that's the story. Let's call it the hidden story of Apple, the Big Mac. So this got me interested in this new technology. This new technology. Would each of you just raise your hand with your copy, with your smartphone? Has anyone not got a smartphone? Right? This piece of machinery, how is it changing our world? The so-called fourth industrial revolution. Now, here is the narrative. This is the history of the first industrial revolution. Begins with the mechanical loom, 1800, that's 250 years ago. And you'll see there is a long period of time, to 1990, when you get the second industrial revolution, mass production. Henry Ford, Fordism, and electricity, the first assembly line. Note electricity. The third industrial revolution, with the first time a computer, personal computer, 1969, 1970. And then there is the emergence of a digitally connected world and the smartphone. Now, what's important about this narrative is that you'll see the period from the first to the second, it's quite a long period of time, the productivity is relatively low. As you move into the digital age, the productivity you get that big leap in productivity. But there's no question about this significance of digital technology and its potential to do things that were unthinkable in the past. For example, I mean, Google has introduced into South Africa a keyboard for the voice typing, and it's now got 8 different languages on this. So I'm not a Luddite. Luddite, in other words, in the early stage of the Industrial Revolution, people, hang on a second, people went around smashing machines because they thought they were taking their jobs. I think that the technology has potential for emancipation, for all kinds of extraordinary things for humankind. But the English historian E.H. Carr used to say, what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. Well, we stand here in the Eastern Cape, Southern Africa. I live in Johannesburg, and this is what I see. I don't see digital technology. Here is, let's call her Nomsa. There's Nomsa. Got up at 5 in the morning to gather cardboard. That cardboard, so it's human labor, right? She's picking up pieces of cardboard. And it's now 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and she's in front of what we call a buyback center, which is they're going to give her 60 Rand. They weigh it, and then they give it to her. And the same was the man there. Now, Nomsa is generating an income. She has 6 dependents. So she's a productive worker. She's looking after her grandchild, right? So she's engaged in childcare. She's also, this cardboard goes to Sabi, the company. They turn it into pulp, paper, and they send it to China. So she's part of a global production chain. And paper pulp is one of our top exports to China. And furthermore, it's a green job. It's a green job. She's taking waste and turning it into value. It's not waste. She's not a waste picker. She's creating value. She has no rights. She has no security. But that's what I see. Yes, the 4th Industrial Revolution. But if you ground it, what you see is something very different from this narrative. And what I've been doing the last few years is research on this narrative. This narrative of, and the first interesting thing about this narrative is that it assumes that we go step by step, stages, first, second, third, fourth. Well, I don't know what electricity is like in Makhanda, but in Johannesburg, we don't have it often, electricity. And electricity is supposed to be the second industrial revolution, right? So this narrative doesn't fit. The first narrative was about public transport. Well, there used to be a train running when I was at university here. A train ran, I don't know if it still runs. And is there a train coming to Grahamstown? No. So that's your first industrial revolution. So what?
Sorry, speak down. Yeah.
So what we see here is not a kind of staircase where you move up and down like happened in England or the United States. What we see here is what I'm going to call combined and uneven development, because side by side with NALSU pushing a cardboard, you've got highly sophisticated automation, robotics, but the two are sitting side by side. So there's nothing predetermined or linear. There's no path that you go through stages 1, 2, 3. We have combined and uneven development, and it's very uneven in Africa. But more importantly, that workers are not waiting to catch up with Europe. Workers are not passive recipients of technology. They contest it. The technology, it's not technology that's driving. It's capital. It's looking for ways of increasing efficiency, increasing its profit by displacing human labor with machines. The machine doesn't get babalas on Monday. It doesn't fall pregnant. It doesn't go on strike. So machines, so it's not the technology. So when the Luddites smashed the machine, it wasn't the machine that was their enemy. It was the way in which it was being used to undercut their jobs. So we have to find a way of thinking about the digital age as an opportunity, but one that's not driven solely by capital. And then thirdly, it's not new. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And then finally, what have I got here? Trouble is when you give them a dialer, these things, it doesn't always work. Okay. Okay. So what I wanted to suggest to you firstly is that this idea of these stages is a narrative of the North, of advanced industrial society. It does not fit into our history. Our history, you've got this unevenness. But the point I really wanted to get to is that it suggested that the fourth industrial revolution is passing Africa by. We've got to catch up. In fact, Manuel Castells, a famous sociologist, dismissed Africa as the dark hole of informational capitalism. He called us the fourth world. Now, what I'd like to do this afternoon is challenge this narrative by making visible what is invisible. I want to argue that Africa has been, since the days of slavery, and continues today to be an integral part of global capitalism. But it remains in the shadow of the digital age. Now, by the shadow, I mean that it is placed in a subordinate position, highly unequal place in the global system. And I want to illustrate this with two examples of where Africa is central. You know, you hear a lot about the idea, you hear a lot about artificial intelligence. You hear about the idea, which I find quite terrifying, of a driverless motor car. You've heard that. Have you ever thought about how you construct an algorithm that allows you to distinguish between a person and a tree? How do you get the machine to distinguish between a person and a tree? Because it's got no driver. Well, if you go to the slums of Nairobi in Kenya, you will find men and women working in abandoned ship containers on the outskirts of Nairobi, who lay the foundations of machine learning. What are they doing? They're sitting on a computer and they are engaged in the tedious task of tagging images, identifying objects in photographs, so that the autonomous vehicles know the difference between a pavement, a person, and a tree. Now, the interesting thing about that invisible world that's constructing the digital age, is that it points out the centrality of human labor, because it's human labor, cheap African labor, that's making digital capitalism. So when people talk about the end of work, how your jobs are going to be displaced by automatic machines and intelligence, and cars without drivers, it's not the end of work. What's happening is the nature of work is changing under the impact of new technology. But it's changing in a way that's largely invisible. We don't see it. We don't realize that behind this complex technology is human labor. So we are central to global capitalism, but not in a visible way. There is a second reason, and I think maybe a more fundamental reason why Africa is central to digital capitalism. And that is the raw materials that make the smartphone. Coltan, the mineral called coltan, is central to digital technology. But what is less well known is that much of the world's deposit of coltan lies in the DRC, in Congo, which, by the way, is gathered in appalling working conditions by child labor. So behind this Steve Jobs and his brilliant design is the sweated child labor of Africa. And you go through the parts. If you take the case, the screen here that you can tap and touch, that's built on tin oxide, not much of which is in Southern Africa. The electronics that drive copper, gold, and silver. The battery that keeps it going, cobalt and manganese. The casing around it from magnesium. Let me illustrate here. There's the elements of the smartphone. Screen, tin oxide, electronics, copper, the battery, cobalt, and the casing. So all the key parts. So how is it possible to argue that Africa is not part of global capitalism when your key instrument of communication is drawn from largely from minerals, but exclusively. So I think that's my first point. I think that we're not peripheral, we're a central part of global capitalism. But I think it's very important to emphasize the uneven nature of the penetration of the digital economy. That's why this idea of us going through 1, 2, 3, 4 stages is misleading, because we have those stages combined. There's no inevitable. In fact, in some countries, we've leapfrogged into the digital age. Africa has some of the highest mobile phone penetration in the world. In Nigeria, for example, very low number of line, but high number of smartphones. And yeah, just to illustrate, I mean, it's South Africa that has the highest, it's overtaken Nigeria. But the fastest, interesting thing, the fastest growing digital is Kenya. Kenya is a very sophisticated digital and growing faster than South Africa. But South Africa is the largest number of platforms. But the interesting thing is, if you actually look at platform work, you will see that there are two kinds of platform. Either your Uber Eats, based outside a restaurant, location-based platform work, or you can have remote work where you're working in cyberspace, in the cloud. There only 1% of employment in South Africa is platform work. So it's very low numbers, but expanding rapidly. But it's not the size of the workforce that's important, I would argue. It's changing the whole landscape of the economy, the wider economy. I call this the Uberization of work, where all forms of work, increasingly, including the university, by the way, become short-term contracts, outsourcing, no benefits. The big companies evade corporate tax. What I want to do now is to highlight 3 central issues raised by digital capitalism. The first is the question of job creation. Now, there's a big argument, and our president has constantly argued that it creates jobs. It's going to create jobs. Well, the evidence is that the jobs that it is creating are precarious jobs, short-term, without employment contracts. And the idea that it gives you freedom and flexibility is misleading, because inside this phone is a boss. It's the algorithm, tells you what to do. I'll come on to that in a moment. But I just wanted to put it forward. It is possible, I suppose, to argue that a bad job is better than no job. And therefore, what we should try to think about these jobs as a step towards decent work. I think I'll come back to that in my conclusion, but I mean, I'm saying this could become decent work, but it have to be dramatically changed to do that. The second point I want to make is that when you start to reflect on the kind of work that's being created, it's not new. If you go back to, no, that's going forward. The second industrial, the first assembly line. The key figure in the Ford assembly line was the idea that you break the work down, you fragment it into small parts. And this is associated with a man called Taylor, Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor, in the early century ago, known by his enemies as Speedy Taylor, he argued that what you have to do, that management should, in order to speed up production, it had to follow three principles. The first was, you must get hold of the knowledge that workers have, classify, tabulate, and reduce the knowledge to rules, laws, and formula. You know, de-skill, take the knowledge out of work. Second, take all brain work out from the worker. In other words, management conceives, workers execute. And that, with that monopoly of knowledge, you can control each step of the labor process and its mode of execution. Now, that sounds awfully awfully like, and I'm calling it digital tailorism. It's not new. Take the app, spits out a sequence of repetitive commands, and you just have to do it. The app makes all the decisions because it has all the information. The app de-skills workers because they just have to follow instructions from programs created by software engineers. Well, that's exactly what Taylorism was. That you take the knowledge, you break it down, and each step worker has to follow. You're not paid to think. You're paid to follow the instructions, and that's what the algorithm does. Inside here is a program. So when you connect and you order your Uber Eats, the rider logs into her tells you where to go, tells you what to charge, and if you don't follow the instructions, you get disconnected. So I try to, the fastest growing job in Johannesburg is food couriers, motorbikes that are driving around the city. And so the freedom couriers experience is somewhat ironic. Riders are free to choose to work long hours in their own time because you pay task, not time task. Yet they are subject to the company's algorithm. An algorithm is a mathematical formula which directs them to where to go, how much to charge. If the riders fail to satisfy, they can be disconnected and receive no income at all. That's research I did with my research assistant, Vuyisile Mini. So what I'm suggesting then is the second point here is that it's digital tailorism is not new, it's just less visible. The algorithm is invisible and inaccessible. Unlike the stopwatch, which is what scientific management is about, it can't be seen, it can't be bargained over, because the mathematical formula in here is inaccessible. It's covered by commercial law and is trade secret of the company. So I'm going to argue that digital tailorism deepens control over workers unprecedented in the history of work, because it's remote. It could be driven from California, instructing you what to do. But here's my third point. How are workers responding to this? Now, when I started looking at this, these are Uber riders outside Mando Chicken restaurant, okay? They're waiting for a call. So when I thought about these riders, I thought, but they can't organize because they're all separated from each other. It's not like a factory where you can organize people, right? They come together and they've all got grievances and you can go out and strike. They're unorganized. Well, when we started talking to them and about their work, they said, actually, we belong to an association of food couriers. It's called the Brothers of Melville. The Brothers of Melville, this is outside UJ, University of Johannesburg, next to Melville. The Brothers of Melville. Now, the Brothers of Melville, it turns out, not a traditional trade union. They are connecting with each other through the app. They formed the Brothers of Melville and they communicate with each other through the smartphone. In fact, so effectively they communicated with each other that they were able to bring food couriers in Johannesburg to a standstill by collectively disconnecting. Collectively, if you collectively disconnect, there's no workers. Now, it's interesting. So it got me thinking that there's something new happening here. In the Ford production line, the assembly line, what Henry Ford had done is break down the building of a motor car. Instead of a whole lot of craftsmen looking to build it, one man would put on the chassis and it'd move on the assembly. Another man would put on the wheels. And so the assembly line would go on until you got to the paint shop at the end. In other words, they were technologically linked together. So Henry Ford, it was a brilliant way of increasing productivity, of efficiency, because you could produce 10 times as many motor cars in an hour as you could with craftsmen. So there's cheaper, more efficient, and of course his real genius is not mass production, but he combined mass production with mass consumption, and by paying them $5 a day, they could end up buying motor cars. So he created a market. But he also, by linking them on assembly line, it meant that if one worker stopped work, the whole production line stopped. You get it? If the guys who've got to put the chassis down don't do it, stop work, stand there, then you can't continue the line. So you've got to negotiate with the workers. That's where the shop steward comes. You had to settle a grievance there on the spot, because the whole basis of Fordism was the economy of speed. You're competing against companies, you want to get the thing moving. So to get the production line moving, you settle, and workers start winning rights on the shop floor. Now, of course, there's something similar happening here. This is new technology. It exercises control over you in ways unprecedented in history, but it also links you together and allows you to disrupt production, as they did in Johannesburg, by connecting countries. So the technology, I'm saying, is a double-edged sword. It increases control, but it also gives you a weapon. It's a double-edged sword. And the brothers of Melville, then, they're not a traditional trade union. They are self-organized. They don't create officials and you pay membership fees. It's more like a stokvel. Do you know what I mean? Where you share credit, rotate credit. If somebody is injured, which happens often because it's dangerous driving a motorbike at night in Johannesburg, when people, Johannesburg, they don't drive, they just aim their motor cars, and you get people get killed, and there's no compensation because they're not defined as workers, they're defined as independent contractors because they said they are self-employed. You're on your own. You're self-employed, not a worker. You don't have the rights of a worker. So there's no compensation. So what happens is the moment somebody gets knocked over, they're onto the phone. Everybody comes to help the body to get help. Or if it's a dead body, and many of them are cross-border migrants, say Uganda. In fact, the brothers of Melville are mostly Ugandans. Put their money together and they'll pay for the body to be sent back to Uganda, to the family. Now isn't that the basic principle of a union? An injury to one, to all. Solidarity, collective solidarity. But it's not a traditional trade union because it's self-organized. It's self-organized, and they are organizable, and they have power. Now, I think you had a discussion on power afterwards, and the different kinds of power. This is not quite working the way I wanted to work. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the trade union movement was built by disruption, what we call structural power, by strikes. But there are also other sources of power. bringing them together collectively. Societal, which is mobilizing the public support, forming an alliance, and institutional power, giving you certain rights, the law, institutions to defend workers. I'll call that institutional power. Let me conclude. I'm not over time, am I? Okay.
Oh, good.
What I'm suggesting to you, I've argued that where capital goes, labor follows. Even in China. In China, there are constant strikes. The difficulty in China is that they can't build organization because it's a very authoritarian society. Capitalism is a dynamic system, and it constantly makes, unmakes, and remakes the working class. So here we see it makes a new kind of work, the Uber taxi. In the process, it's unmaking the traditional taxi, right? And it remakes itself, then it starts to organize in it. So it's a constant process of unmaking, making, and remaking. And in the process, new sources of power emerges. And let me illustrate historically. You know, in the 1930s, in the United States, when they introduced the mass production of Ford, people said, that's the end of labor. They said it's the end of labor because they were talking about the end of the craft union, the craft worker. Those men who had a skill and bargained with their skill. What they didn't realize that what Fordism, the assembly line, was creating a new kind of worker, a semi-skilled machine operator, and therefore a new kind of union, an industrial union. So what they were talking about in the 1930s in the United States was not the end of labor, but the end of a particular kind of organization, the craft union. What I'm suggesting to you is that we are in an age of experimentation. It's not clear what exact forms are going to emerge in the digital age. But the research that we've been doing, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Accra, is that what's emerging is self-organization of networks that use the digital technology, self-organized networks. And to understand and build these new organizations, you need a new generation of idealists. A new generation of idealists to help recast, reshape the power of labor. This, I believe, is the challenge that Neil Aggett would have put to you as the generation of the digital age. And to the intellectuals, I think, Neil would have said, don't be Luddites, don't try and smash the machines, but go out, talk to the workers, find out what kind of organizations are emerging. And I think it's only through that kind of new forms of organization that it's possible to make sure that the brilliance of this new technology is shared with the men and women who I've suggested to you are largely invisible from Steve Jobs and others, that they should share in the wealth they're creating. Thank you.